Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Welcome back, history buffs, to another thrilling episode of the History AI podcast. I'm Chuck.
And I'm Marco. Today, we're diving into a topic that's bound to ruffle some feathers: the life and ambitions of Alexander Hamilton. This isn't your average love letter to one of America's founding fathers. Nope, today we're putting the spotlight on his lesser-known, more controversial side. Buckle up, folks.
That's right. We're kicking off year 2 with a bang. But before we get started, a quick reminder to subscribe, rate, and share the podcast. Every 5-star review helps us reach more people, and we truly appreciate your support.
And don't forget, we've got some brand new merchandise available. You can find the link in the show notes. Show your love for the History AI podcast wherever you go.
Now, let's get into it. When most people think of Alexander Hamilton today, they picture the face on the $10 bill, the brilliant mind behind the Federalist Papers, and, thanks to a certain Broadway musical, a rags-to-riches story that embodies the American dream.
That's right, Chuck. Hamilton has been immortalized as one of America's greatest founding fathers, a self-made man who rose from humble beginnings in the Caribbean to become one of the most influential figures in the early United States. His contributions to the country are often celebrated, from his role in establishing the financial system to his relentless advocacy for the Constitution.
And to be fair, there's no denying his achievements. Hamilton was a gifted writer, an innovative thinker, and a tireless worker. His impact on the financial foundation of the United States is still felt today. But there's a lot more to the story than just the success and triumph that history books and popular culture often highlight.
Absolutely, Chuck. Behind the story of the self-made immigrant who helped shape America's early government lies a man with complex motives, a burning ambition for power, and a vision for America that was far from democratic. Hamilton was a political powerhouse, sure, but he was also a controversial figure who often acted out of self-interest rather than for the greater good of the country.
Hamilton's life was marked by a constant struggle for power and influence. He wasn't just a participant in the formation of the United States, he was a driving force behind many of its early policies. But his methods and motives weren't always pure. He often pursued his own agenda with little regard for the consequences on his colleagues or the fledgling nation.
That's right. And today, we're going to peel back the layers of this celebrated founding father to expose some of his less flattering traits. We'll explore his monarchist tendencies, his penchant for using people to climb the political ladder, and his attempts to control the government from behind the scenes. It's a side of Hamilton that doesn't often make it into the spotlight, but is crucial to understanding the man behind the myth.
Exactly, Marco. We're diving into the less celebrated aspects of Hamilton's life. He wasn't just the financial genius or the patriot we've been taught about, he was also a man who believed in a strong, centralized government, sometimes to a fault. He saw himself as an indispensable architect of the nation and wasn't afraid to bend, or even break, the rules to achieve his vision.
And it's this ambition that drove Hamilton to push for a government structure that, ironically, looked a lot like the British system he had fought against during the Revolution. While other founding fathers were advocating for checks and balances, Hamilton often leaned towards concentrated power, and some might say, towards a form of monarchy.
So today, we're going to take a hard look at Alexander Hamilton. Not the hero of the Revolution, not the star of a musical, but the ambitious, power-hungry politician who saw America's potential and wanted to mold it in his own image, no matter what it took. This is the untold story of Alexander Hamilton, and it's not always a pretty one.
That's right, Chuck. Despite Hamilton's role in breaking free from the British Crown, his political beliefs were heavily influenced by the British system of governance. He genuinely believed that a strong, centralized authority was crucial for the success and stability of the United States. In fact, he often expressed doubts about whether a republic, where power was vested in the people, could ever be as effective as a monarchy.
Now, let's dive into one of the most controversial aspects of Alexander Hamilton's political philosophy, his monarchist tendencies. This may come as a shock to some, but the man who fought in the American Revolution against British tyranny had a surprising admiration for certain elements of monarchical government. To fully understand this, we need to look at Hamilton's experiences and his worldview. Born out of wedlock in the Caribbean, Hamilton faced hardship from a young age. He was a self-made man who climbed the social and political ladder through his intelligence and relentless work ethic. This background shaped his belief in a meritocratic system where the capable few, rather than the many, should lead.
And this is where his monarchist tendencies come into play. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Hamilton proposed a government that looked eerily similar to the British monarchy. He suggested having a president who would serve for life, assuming good behavior, much like a king. He also proposed a Senate that would be elected for life, creating a body that functioned similarly to the House of Lords in Britain.
It's clear Hamilton had little faith in the average citizen's ability to make informed decisions about governance. He openly criticized what he called the excess of democracy that he felt plagued the Articles of Confederation. In his eyes, the general public was too easily swayed by demagogues and incapable of maintaining a stable government.
This belief wasn't just theoretical for Hamilton, it influenced his actions and decisions. During the Constitutional Convention, while other delegates were crafting checks and balances to prevent the rise of another monarchy, Hamilton was arguing for stronger executive power. He saw it as essential for preventing the kind of chaos and inefficiency that had characterized the weak central government under the Articles of Confederation.
And let's not forget the depth of his admiration for the British system. Hamilton believed that a hereditary monarchy, while not perfect, provided a stability that republics could not match. He even once referred to the British government as the best model in existence. For Hamilton, the idea of an energetic, centralized government led by a singular, powerful executive was not just preferable but necessary.
What's fascinating here is how Hamilton's ideas diverged sharply from his contemporaries like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who championed the rights of the individual and feared the tyranny of centralized power. Hamilton, however, saw these fears as unfounded and believed that a strong central government was the only way to ensure the survival and prosperity of the United States.
His monarchist tendencies didn't stop at theoretical musings either. Hamilton's financial policies as Secretary of the Treasury also reflected his desire to centralize power. By creating a national bank and assuming state debts, he aimed to tie the states more closely to a powerful federal government, thereby increasing the central authority's control over the entire nation.
But Hamilton's flirtation with monarchy was not just about creating a strong government. It was also about creating a government that could stand the test of time. He saw the chaos of the French Revolution, the instability of other fledgling republics, and he genuinely feared that a weak central government in America would lead to similar disarray or even dissolution.
And let's be clear, Hamilton didn't want a literal king for America. His vision was more nuanced than that. He sought a strong executive leader, one with the authority to act decisively but still accountable to the people, albeit in a much more limited way than the other founding fathers envisioned.
Still, Hamilton's advocacy for a quasi-monarchical system where only the elite would govern was a direct contradiction to the egalitarian ideals that many Americans held dear, even in those early days. It's a stark reminder that the founding fathers were not a monolithic group with a unified vision. They were deeply divided on what form the new government should take, and Hamilton's monarchist inclinations represent just how divergent those ideas were.
So, when we talk about Alexander Hamilton, we have to recognize the complexities of his political philosophy. His belief in a strong, centralized government with almost monarchical elements was both a product of his personal experiences and his genuine fear of anarchy. Yet, it also highlights his distrust of democracy and his willingness to concentrate power, often at the expense of the very freedoms he fought for during the Revolution.
That's right. Hamilton's monarchist tendencies are a critical part of understanding who he was and what he wanted for America. It's a reminder that the road to creating a new nation was filled with conflicting ideas and that the path we ultimately took could have been very different if Hamilton had had his way.
Now, let's talk about Alexander Hamilton's talent for using the people around him to climb the political ladder. If there's one thing Hamilton excelled at, it was leveraging relationships to his advantage. He had a knack for identifying powerful individuals, aligning himself with them, and then extracting what he needed to further his own ambitions before moving on.
Hamilton's relationship with George Washington is a prime example of this tactic. During the Revolutionary War, Hamilton served as Washington's aide-de-camp, which was a highly influential position. As Washington's right-hand man, Hamilton had unprecedented access to the general, which he used to build his own reputation and political network.
And it wasn't just during the war that Hamilton utilized this connection. After the war ended, when Washington became the first president of the United States, Hamilton was appointed as the first Secretary of the Treasury. This position gave Hamilton even more power and influence, allowing him to shape the economic future of the new nation.
But Hamilton's relationship with Washington wasn't as chummy as it might appear. Letters and diary entries reveal that Washington was well aware of Hamilton's self-serving nature. In fact, Washington once wrote that Hamilton would only reach out to him when he needed something, indicating that Hamilton was more interested in using Washington's status than maintaining a genuine friendship.
That's pretty telling, isn't it? Washington, a man known for his loyalty and dedication, clearly saw through Hamilton's attempts to use him. Yet, Hamilton was undeterred. He knew that having Washington's favor was crucial to his own rise in politics, and he wasn't afraid to exploit that relationship to its fullest extent.
And this wasn't an isolated incident. Hamilton had a long history of using others for his personal gain. During the Revolutionary War, there's a lesser-known episode where Hamilton tried to manipulate the revolutionary soldiers to further his agenda.
Right. In the early 1780s, the Continental Army soldiers were growing restless due to a lack of pay from Congress. Instead of advocating for the soldiers' pay, Hamilton saw this frustration as an opportunity to pressure Congress into adopting his financial plans. He privately advised members of Congress to withhold the soldiers' pay even longer, hoping that the growing unrest would lead to a confrontation.
Hamilton's idea was to incite the soldiers to march on Congress, essentially threatening a coup if Congress didn't act. His hope was that this display of force would shock Congress into conceding more power to the national government, specifically, the power to levy taxes and pay its debts, which aligned perfectly with Hamilton's vision of a strong central government.
This plan shows just how far Hamilton was willing to go. He was ready to use the anger and desperation of unpaid soldiers as a political weapon, risking potential violence and destabilization, all to push his agenda. And let's not forget, this wasn't just about paying the troops. Hamilton wanted to demonstrate that a stronger, more centralized government was necessary, one that could enforce laws and maintain order, even if it meant bending democratic principles.
Exactly, Chuck. Hamilton's actions here weren't about justice or supporting the soldiers' rightful demands. They were about using their plight as a lever to gain more power for himself and to mold the government into his desired shape. His willingness to manipulate people and situations for his own benefit is a recurring theme in his career.
And these are just a couple of examples. Throughout his life, Hamilton continually aligned himself with those who could help him advance, only to discard them when they were no longer useful. His relationship with John Adams, for instance, began cordially enough, but as soon as Adams' presidency didn't serve Hamilton's goals, he actively worked against him, undermining Adams' administration from within the Federalist Party.
Hamilton's manipulation of relationships and situations paints a picture of a man driven by ambition, often at the expense of those around him. He was willing to risk others' reputations, and even the stability of the nation, to ensure his vision and his personal advancement came first. It's a clear demonstration of his political cunning, but also his moral flexibility when it came to the pursuit of power.
It's these actions that make Hamilton such a complicated figure. On one hand, he was brilliant and incredibly influential in shaping America. On the other hand, he was willing to use and discard people like chess pieces in his quest for authority and control. He wasn't just about building the nation, he was about building his own legacy, no matter who he had to step on to do it.
And that, Chuck, is a part of Hamilton's story that often gets glossed over. He wasn't just a visionary leader, he was also a shrewd, and at times ruthless, political operator who didn't shy away from using others to achieve his ends.
That's right, Marco. Understanding this side of Hamilton gives us a fuller picture of who he was, not just the financial genius and founding father, but also a man with a relentless drive for power who often put his ambitions above all else. Moving on, let's dive into one of Alexander Hamilton's most significant, yet controversial, political maneuvers, his manipulation of the Federalist Party. Hamilton's involvement with the Federalists was much more than just being a party leader. He used the party as a tool to control the political landscape of the early United States, almost as if he was trying to rule the country from the shadows.
That's right, Chuck. Hamilton was one of the key figures in the creation of the Federalist Party. The party was initially formed to promote the ratification of the Constitution and advocate for a strong national government, which aligned perfectly with Hamilton's vision. However, Hamilton's influence within the party went far beyond typical leadership. He saw the Federalist Party as a means to achieve his broader goal of shaping the nation according to his ideals, often without regard for the democratic processes or the actual leaders who were supposed to be in charge.
Hamilton's goal was always to centralize power in the federal government, which he believed was essential for the country's survival and prosperity. To achieve this, he frequently operated behind the scenes, using the Federalist Party to manipulate political outcomes and maintain control over national policies. His tactics often involved pitting members of his own party against each other, all while keeping his hands clean of the public fallout.
A great example of this is Hamilton's relationship with President John Adams. Although Adams was a Federalist, his views on government and foreign policy often conflicted with Hamilton's. Rather than supporting Adams, Hamilton took a more Machiavellian approach. He sought to undermine Adams' authority and policies whenever they didn't align with his own vision for the country.
It's true. Hamilton actively worked against Adams from within the Federalist Party, effectively running a shadow government. He even went as far as writing a pamphlet in 1800 that harshly criticized Adams, calling his leadership erratic and unfit. This wasn't just about personal differences, it was about keeping control over the party and, by extension, the government's direction.
This pamphlet, known as the Letter from Alexander Hamilton, concerning the public conduct and character of John Adams, Esquire, President of the United States, was meant to sway Federalist opinion and ensure that Adams would not be re-elected. Hamilton believed that Adams' unpredictable behavior was a threat to the stability and direction of the government, but more importantly, it was a threat to Hamilton's control over federal policy.
And Hamilton's power grab didn't stop there. During his time as Secretary of the Treasury under President George Washington, Hamilton essentially ran the Federalist Party from the Treasury Department. He used his position to influence not just economic policy but also political appointments and legislative agendas. He had his hands in everything from foreign policy to domestic affairs, often operating with more authority than the actual president.
What's fascinating is how Hamilton managed to maintain such influence while not holding the highest office. He orchestrated a kind of de facto leadership by keeping close ties with key Federalist figures and ensuring that his allies were placed in strategic positions within the government. This allowed him to guide policy decisions and maintain control without ever needing to be the face of those decisions.
Another example of Hamilton ruling from the shadows was his handling of the Federalist-controlled Congress. He often wrote detailed policy papers and legislative proposals, essentially dictating what the party's stance should be on key issues. He wasn't afraid to step on toes, even within his own party, to ensure that his economic plans and vision for a strong central government were implemented.
And let's not forget his efforts to manipulate the judiciary. Hamilton knew that having Federalist judges on the bench was crucial for maintaining long-term control over the country's laws and direction. His influence helped shape the early Supreme Court and ensured that it would uphold federal power over state rights, further consolidating the centralized authority he so deeply believed in.
Hamilton's strategy of using the Federalist Party to control the country's political narrative and direction was a masterclass in behind-the-scenes manipulation. He leveraged the party's resources, its leaders, and its policies to shape the United States in his image. It was his way of ruling the country from the shadows, pulling the strings of power without ever being the official figurehead.
This all-consuming desire for control eventually led to the downfall of the Federalist Party. Hamilton's relentless drive to push his own agenda, even at the cost of unity within the party, created deep divisions among its members. His heavy-handed tactics alienated many Federalists who were uncomfortable with his authoritarian approach and his disregard for democratic norms.
By the time of the 1800 presidential election, the Federalist Party was deeply fractured. Hamilton's efforts to manipulate the election by secretly advocating for Charles Cotesworth Pinckney over John Adams, even suggesting that the party should split its votes to force a deadlock, was the final straw. His schemes backfired spectacularly, leading to the election of Thomas Jefferson and effectively ending the Federalist Party's influence in American politics.
It's a classic example of overreach. Hamilton's desire to control everything from behind the scenes ended up destroying the very foundation he had built. His vision for America, while grand and ambitious, was ultimately undermined by his own relentless pursuit of power and his willingness to subvert the democratic process.
So, when we talk about Alexander Hamilton, we can't ignore his role as a master manipulator and his efforts to control the early United States through the Federalist Party. His desire to shape the country in his own image led him to some pretty dark places, revealing a side of Hamilton that was far more complex and, frankly, more ruthless than the idealized version many people know today.
Indeed, Chuck. Hamilton was a brilliant strategist, but his determination to control the country from the shadows also shows a man who was willing to put his personal vision above the democratic ideals of the young nation. It's a reminder that even our most revered founding fathers had their flaws and were far from perfect.
Now let's explore one of the more controversial aspects of Alexander Hamilton's career, his attempts to run the country behind President George Washington's back. While Hamilton was officially the Secretary of the Treasury, his influence extended far beyond his assigned role. In many ways, Hamilton acted as a shadow president, often making decisions or pursuing actions that not only stretched the boundaries of his authority but also directly conflicted with Washington's intentions.
That's right, Chuck. Hamilton's relationship with Washington was complex. On one hand, Washington deeply respected Hamilton's intellect and trusted him with significant responsibilities. But on the other hand, Hamilton often took advantage of this trust, using his position to push his own agenda, sometimes without Washington's full knowledge or consent.
One of the most notable examples of Hamilton's overreach is his involvement in foreign policy, particularly with the Jay Treaty of 1794. The treaty was meant to resolve lingering conflicts between the United States and Great Britain following the Revolutionary War. While Washington was the official head of state and the face of the negotiations, Hamilton was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Indeed. When Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to Britain to negotiate the treaty, Hamilton secretly provided Jay with instructions that reflected his own pro-British views. Hamilton believed that a close relationship with Britain was crucial for America's economic growth, especially in terms of trade. He saw the treaty as an opportunity to stabilize relations with Britain and secure the economic foundation of the young nation. However, his approach was highly controversial and not entirely in line with Washington's more balanced outlook.
What's particularly striking is how Hamilton operated. He communicated with Jay directly, often bypassing Washington and the rest of the cabinet. Hamilton advised Jay to be lenient with the British and accept terms that many Americans, including other members of Washington's cabinet, found too conciliatory. Hamilton wasn't just advising, he was effectively directing foreign policy, a role that should have been reserved for the President and Secretary of State.
And it didn't stop there. Hamilton also played a significant role in domestic affairs, particularly in the build-up to the Quasi-War with France in the late 1790s. The Quasi-War was an undeclared naval conflict between the United States and France, spurred by French anger over the Jay Treaty and other diplomatic tensions. Hamilton, ever the hawk, saw this as an opportunity to strengthen the military and consolidate federal power.
Despite Washington's desire to avoid unnecessary conflict, Hamilton pushed aggressively for military preparedness. He helped create the Provisional Army and even positioned himself to lead it, despite having no official military role at the time. Hamilton's aim was clear. He wanted to use the threat of war with France to justify a stronger central government and increase his own influence within that government.
This maneuvering put Hamilton at odds with other key figures, including President John Adams, who was more inclined towards peace. Hamilton's aggressive stance towards France, including his support for military build-up and his desire to invade Spanish Florida and Louisiana, reflected his broader strategy of using external threats to justify internal consolidation of power.
Washington, who had appointed Hamilton as his Secretary of the Treasury, often found himself in the uncomfortable position of reigning in his ambitious subordinate. Despite this, Hamilton's influence was so pervasive that Washington struggled to contain him. Washington valued loyalty and competency, and Hamilton certainly delivered on the latter, but his loyalty often seemed to be to his own vision for America rather than to Washington's leadership.
A clear example of Hamilton's overreach can be seen in his involvement in the drafting of Washington's farewell address. While Washington is credited with delivering this pivotal document, Hamilton was the principal author. The address warned against political factions and foreign alliances, echoing many of Hamilton's own views. However, Hamilton's fingerprints are all over the speech, which was as much about preserving his own legacy as it was about advising future generations.
What's fascinating is that Hamilton used this opportunity not just to express Washington's thoughts, but also to subtly advance his own agenda. The warnings about political parties, for instance, were a direct reflection of Hamilton's frustration with the growing opposition to Federalist policies. He was essentially using Washington's farewell to the nation to critique his political rivals and to shape the narrative for years to come.
Hamilton's actions throughout Washington's presidency exemplify his tendency to operate behind the scenes, often pushing his own agenda regardless of the president's intentions. Whether it was foreign policy, military buildup, or domestic governance, Hamilton frequently acted as the de facto leader, steering the ship of state from the shadows.
And this wasn't just about getting things done, this was about control. Hamilton wanted to shape the country's future, and he wasn't content with merely advising the president. He sought to direct the course of the nation himself, often at the expense of democratic processes and the will of the elected leader.
It's a testament to Hamilton's immense political skills and his relentless ambition. But it also highlights a darker side to his legacy. Hamilton's desire to control the government from behind the scenes, even at the risk of undermining the president, reveals just how far he was willing to go to impose his vision of a strong, centralized America.
So, when we look at Hamilton's role in Washington's presidency, we see a man who wasn't just a brilliant advisor or a financial genius. He was also a master manipulator who wielded power from the shadows, often putting his own agenda above the very leaders he served. This is the side of Hamilton that history sometimes overlooks, but it's crucial to understanding the full scope of his impact on the early United States. Next up, let's talk about the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 and how Alexander Hamilton's behind-the-scenes maneuvering played a pivotal role in their passage. These laws are often cited as some of the most controversial legislation in American history, and Hamilton's involvement showcases just how deeply he was willing to interfere in governmental affairs, even when he wasn't in an official position.
That's right, Chuck. The Alien and Sedition Acts were a series of laws passed by the Federalist-controlled Congress, aimed at strengthening national security but also clearly designed to suppress dissent against the Federalist government. These acts made it harder for immigrants to become citizens, allowed the president to imprison or deport non-citizens deemed dangerous, and criminalized making false, scandalous, and malicious statements against the government.
On the surface, it looked like President John Adams was the driving force behind these acts. But in reality, Alexander Hamilton was pulling many of the strings from behind the scenes. Although Hamilton was no longer in the cabinet, his influence was still incredibly strong. Many of Adams' cabinet members were loyal to Hamilton, not to Adams, and they often went to Hamilton for guidance before making any decisions.
This allegiance to Hamilton rather than to the sitting president created a toxic environment within the executive branch. Adams grew increasingly frustrated with the fact that his own cabinet seemed more inclined to follow Hamilton's directives than his own. This disconnect led to a serious breakdown in trust between Adams and his advisors. In some instances, Adams felt like he was being undermined at every turn, as his cabinet members continued to report back to Hamilton and seek his counsel.
And it wasn't just passive advice from Hamilton. He was actively pushing for these laws as a way to solidify Federalist power and suppress the growing influence of the Democratic-Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Hamilton saw the Alien and Sedition Acts as tools to silence opposition and ensure that the Federalists, and by extension himself, maintained control over the government.
The tension between Adams and Hamilton came to a head when Adams discovered the extent of Hamilton's meddling. There are reports that Adams, in a fit of rage, effectively threw Hamilton out of his office, furious over the interference in his administration. Adams was no fan of the Sedition Act and was very reluctant to enforce it, but the pressure from his Hamilton-influenced cabinet was overwhelming.
This clash only deepened Adams' mistrust of those around him. He started to see Hamilton not just as an adversary but as a shadowy puppet master who was manipulating his administration from the sidelines. Adams became increasingly paranoid, feeling that his own cabinet was more loyal to Hamilton than to him, and this paranoia wasn't entirely unfounded.
Hamilton's influence over the cabinet was so pervasive that Adams even referred to them as a British faction, criticizing them for their slavish devotion to Hamilton's Federalist ideals and policies. Adams believed that Hamilton was using his sway over the cabinet to undermine his presidency and push a more aggressive and authoritarian agenda than Adams was comfortable with.
The Alien and Sedition Acts were, in many ways, the culmination of this struggle. While they were passed under Adams' administration, they reflected Hamilton's more extreme views on centralized power and governance. Hamilton saw these laws as necessary measures to protect the government from its critics and to ensure that the Federalists could maintain control. He had little patience for dissent or opposition, and he believed that a strong hand was needed to steer the young nation.
However, the acts backfired spectacularly. The Sedition Act, in particular, was widely unpopular and seen as a blatant violation of free speech and freedom of the press. It led to numerous arrests and prosecutions of journalists and political opponents, fueling public outrage and contributing to the rise of the Democratic-Republican Party.
And here's the kicker: the fallout from these acts and the infighting within the Federalist Party, largely driven by Hamilton's machinations, ultimately led to Adams' defeat in the election of 1800. The rift between Adams and Hamilton had become so deep that Hamilton actively worked against Adams' re-election campaign, favoring Charles Cotesworth Pinckney instead.
The result was a fractured Federalist Party and a victory for Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, effectively ending Federalist control over the presidency. Hamilton's overreach and his relentless pursuit of power had not only cost the Federalists the White House but also exposed the deep divisions within the party itself.
So, when we look at the Alien and Sedition Acts and the chaos that ensued, it's clear that Hamilton's influence, his need to control, and his willingness to undermine even his own party's president played a huge role in one of the most tumultuous periods of early American politics. He wasn't just a policy advisor or a behind-the-scenes strategist, he was actively trying to run the country from the shadows, often with disastrous results.
That's right, Chuck. The Alien and Sedition Acts and the subsequent fallout are a stark reminder of just how far Hamilton was willing to go to maintain his influence and control. His actions not only damaged his relationship with Adams but also weakened the very party he had helped build, showcasing the double-edged sword of his relentless ambition.
As we've seen so far, Alexander Hamilton was a man of immense talent and ambition. But, as with many figures of power, his relentless drive and controversial decisions eventually led to his downfall. Hamilton's fall from grace was a complex mix of political missteps, personal scandals, and the ultimate consequences of his overreaching influence.
Let's start with the political blunders. By the late 1790s, Hamilton's heavy-handed control over the Federalist Party had created significant fractures within the party. His meddling in John Adams' presidency and his push for the Alien and Sedition Acts had alienated many Federalists who were uncomfortable with his authoritarian style. This division became painfully clear in the lead-up to the 1800 presidential election.
Right. The election of 1800 was supposed to be a straightforward contest between John Adams, the incumbent Federalist president, and Thomas Jefferson, the leader of the Democratic-Republican Party. But Hamilton, dissatisfied with Adams, decided to intervene yet again. He attempted to manipulate the election by throwing his support behind Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, another Federalist, instead of Adams.
Hamilton's plan was to have Federalist electors vote equally for Adams and Pinckney, with the hope that Pinckney would end up with more votes and become president. But the plan backfired spectacularly. Many Federalists in New England, loyal to Adams, caught wind of Hamilton's scheme and decided to vote exclusively for Adams, leaving Pinckney with fewer votes. This division effectively handed the election to Jefferson and Aaron Burr, his running mate, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties in American history. However, it was a significant blow to Hamilton and the Federalist Party.
And as if political miscalculation wasn't enough, Hamilton's personal life also came back to haunt him. One of the most damaging scandals of his career was the revelation of his extramarital affair with Maria Reynolds. The affair, which began in 1791, was more than just a personal indiscretion, it had political implications that Hamilton could never have anticipated.
That's right. The affair with Maria Reynolds was first exposed in 1797 when Hamilton's political enemies, including Thomas Jefferson's allies, discovered evidence that Hamilton had not only been involved with Reynolds but had also made payments to her husband, James Reynolds. These payments were initially interpreted as evidence that Hamilton had engaged in financial corruption, potentially using his position as Secretary of the Treasury to profit illegally.
To clear his name of the corruption charges, Hamilton made the fateful decision to publish the Reynolds pamphlet. In this document, he admitted to the affair but vehemently denied any financial misconduct. Hamilton thought that by coming clean about the affair, he could preserve his political reputation. But the pamphlet had the opposite effect.
The Reynolds pamphlet was a bombshell. Not only did it publicly confirm Hamilton's affair, but it also painted him as a morally compromised figure. The public and political backlash was intense. Hamilton's enemies used the scandal to attack his character, painting him as untrustworthy and hypocritical. Even some of his allies found it difficult to defend his actions.
Hamilton's reputation was further tarnished by the scandal, and he lost much of his political influence. The affair revealed a personal recklessness that many Americans found disturbing, especially from a man who had positioned himself as a champion of virtue and a leader of the Federalist cause.
Hamilton's personal life wasn't his only downfall. His incessant need to control every political situation, his tendency to undermine allies, and his divisive tactics eventually alienated him from the very people he needed most. The Reynolds pamphlet only added fuel to the fire, showcasing a Hamilton who was willing to sacrifice personal integrity to protect his political career.
By the early 1800s, Hamilton found himself increasingly isolated. His influence over the Federalist Party waned as the party fractured. His once strong relationship with George Washington was no longer a shield, and his public image had been severely damaged by both his political maneuverings and his personal scandals.
It's also worth noting that Hamilton's feud with Aaron Burr, which had been simmering for years, reached a boiling point during this period. Burr, who had been angered by Hamilton's political attacks and slights, challenged him to a duel in 1804. Despite Hamilton's fall from grace, he accepted the challenge, leading to the infamous duel in Weehawken, New Jersey.
The duel with Burr was the final act in Hamilton's tumultuous life. Hamilton was fatally shot and died the following day, marking a tragic end to one of America's most dynamic, yet divisive, founding fathers. His death was a direct result of the very kind of political gamesmanship that had defined much of his career.
Hamilton's fall from grace is a stark reminder of the double-edged sword of ambition. His relentless drive to shape the nation's future and his desire for power led him to great heights, but also to a tragic downfall. His personal and political missteps, combined with his uncompromising style, ultimately cost him not only his career but also his life.
So, while Hamilton's contributions to the founding of the United States are undeniable, his story is also a cautionary tale about the perils of ambition unchecked by humility or restraint. It's a complex legacy, one that reflects both the brilliance and the flaws of one of America's most enigmatic founding fathers.
So, let's speculate a bit. What if Hamilton's vision for America had come to pass? A strong central government with monarchical tendencies, led by an elite ruling class.
It's a chilling thought, Marco. We could have seen a very different America. Imagine a country where the president serves for life, with a powerful Senate functioning like an aristocratic house. There's no guarantee of free speech or the press under those circumstances. Hamilton's preference for a British-style government suggests he might have been comfortable with far less democratic participation.
And remember, Hamilton wasn't a fan of the common man's involvement in government. He was deeply skeptical of direct democracy and believed that only a select few were truly capable of governing. If his ideas had taken root, we might have had an America where political power was concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy elites, with the rest of the population having little say in their own governance.
That kind of system could have easily paved the way for authoritarian rule. Hamilton's admiration for strong, centralized authority might have led to a system where dissent was not tolerated, and personal freedoms were severely restricted. His actions with the Alien and Sedition Acts, pushing for laws that limited criticism of the government, give us a glimpse of how he might have tried to control the narrative and maintain power.
And let's not forget his financial policies. While they helped stabilize the economy, they were also geared towards consolidating power among the wealthy. If Hamilton had his way, America might have developed into a nation with stark class divisions, with a government primarily serving the interests of the rich.
It's fascinating to think about, Marco. Hamilton's America would have been one of strict hierarchy, centralized control, and perhaps, limited freedoms. The democratic ideals that Jefferson, Madison, and others fought for could have been overshadowed by Hamilton's desire for a strong, almost authoritarian government.
And it's important to remember that history could have gone in so many different directions. Hamilton's vision for America was just one of many competing ideas. The fact that his version didn't fully materialize is a testament to the strength of the checks and balances the other founding fathers put in place.
Exactly. It's a reminder that the founding fathers weren't a monolithic group with a single vision for America. They had different ideas, different ambitions, and different plans for the country's future. And Hamilton's vision, while influential, was not the one that ultimately defined the United States.
So, where does that leave us with Alexander Hamilton today? We've covered his ambition, his controversial ideas, and his manipulative tactics. But his legacy is complicated, isn't it?
Absolutely, Marco. Despite all of his flaws and missteps, we can't overlook the profound impact Hamilton had on the formation of the United States. His financial policies, for better or worse, laid the groundwork for the American economy. His advocacy for a strong federal government helped to shape the Constitution. And his contributions to the Federalist Papers are still studied as key documents in understanding American political theory.
But we also can't ignore the darker side of his legacy. Hamilton's relentless pursuit of power, his disregard for democratic principles when they didn't align with his goals, and his manipulation of others for personal gain, all these actions show a man who was willing to put his own ambitions above the ideals of the nation he helped create.
Hamilton is a reminder that history is rarely black and white. He was a brilliant, flawed, ambitious man who played a pivotal role in America's early years. His legacy is one of great achievements and equally great controversies.
And that's why it's so important to study figures like Hamilton in their entirety. We need to understand both their contributions and their failings to get a complete picture of how our nation was shaped. It's not just about celebrating or condemning, it's about understanding.
Well said, Marco. And to all our listeners out there, remember that history is full of complex characters like Hamilton. It's our job to look beyond the surface and uncover the full story.
That's right. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider giving us a 5-star review. It helps us reach more history buffs like you and continue to grow this podcast.
And don't forget, we love hearing from you. If you have any topic suggestions or feedback, hit us up on social media. We're always looking for new ideas and ways to improve.
Also, make sure to check out our new merchandise. We've got some great stuff for all you history enthusiasts. The link is in the show notes, so be sure to take a look.
And remember, every episode of the History AI podcast is evergreen, so you can go back and listen to any episode at any time.
Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time with another dive into the fascinating world of history.
Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the past. Thanks for listening. Discover the dark, enchanting world of shadowed journeys, the tales of Jordan and Squishy. Follow Jordan, a seemingly innocent girl with a hidden power, and her loyal companion Squishy, who reincarnates into different animals after each battle. Venture into the ominous depths of the Whispering Woods as they face fierce creatures and uncover ancient secrets. Will Jordan succumb to the darkness within, or will she find the strength to forge a new destiny? Perfect for fans of dark fantasy and epic quests, this spellbinding tale will captivate and leave you pondering the fine line between hero and villain. Dive into Shadowed Journeys today. Available on Amazon now.